Xanthé Mallet, welcome into the weeds. It's a real thrill to have you on the podcast.
Thank you for inviting me.
You are a massive overachiever. Can I say that? Of all the people that have been on the podcast, you're an anthropologist, you're an archaeologist, you're a criminologist, you're a dancer, you're a lecturer, you're an author, you're a podcaster, you're
Jack of all trades.
a jack of all trades. But there's a theme running through all of your work, and that is a fascination with the stories that the past, and in particular the dead, can tell us. It's a key part of archaeology, anthropology and criminology. Where did that fascination come from?
That's a really good question. So I remember when I was very young, probably too young, I was reading a book about Jack the Ripper. And I remember when, now looking back at it, I found that story fascinating. Obviously, it's probably, one of the most enduring cold cases that anyone will mention. And, we had pictures of the victims in that book that I was reading. I was probably about 9 or 10. I didn't think anything of it at the time, but now I look back and think it's maybe a bit unusual for a, child of 9 or 10 to be reading a book about, such gruesome crimes. But I guess, I was just interested in the human side of the story. My mum is a dancer. That's where the kind of performance side comes from. My dad's was an engineer. So I kind of this weird hybrid between performer, dancer and engineer. And I did dance until I was 18. But when I decided that I wanted to stop being a performer and go to university, I decided to study archaeology. I don't really know why. I just needed something to do. I think that I thought would be interesting, but all of the courses that I enjoyed were all about humans, either evolution or something to do with the human story. Then I continued my studies in human evolution at master's level at Cambridge, and then at PhD moved into forensics. So that was when I started looking at the head and face and if we can improve methods of identifying people facially.
Amazing. But you were born in Scotland, grew up in England.
Correct.
I have these visions of you detectoristing or whatever you call it, or over moors or digging up Saxon hoards as an archaeology student. Did you do any of that? Did you do any treasure hunting or tomb raiding?
I went to Pompeii actually, and again looked at some of the cultural stuff in Pompeii, but also the human remains that are still in Pompeii, or the evidence that still exists in relation to human remains. So that's the kind of the most interesting dig I've ever been on. When I studied archaeology, I was definitely more interested in the humans. I wasn't so much interested in the culture. Pots and cloth never did it for me.
Bits of broken
pots
yep.
with my little paintbrush. No, not interested in that. But give me anything to do with evolution or humans, then that's what fascinated me. But I guess when I went through to masters, I then realized that I wanted to do something that could genuinely help somebody now. So that's why I decided to go down the forensic route. I was very lucky to get a scholarship to study PhD. And so I knew that I wanted to do something where my skills of investigation and understanding human anatomy, etc., could be used to help people either alive today or recently deceased victims whose families still need answers.
So tell us about that. What can anatomy tell us? So you've got potentially a corpse or a skeleton in a grave, or that's been uncovered. What can you learn from a corpse or someone's anatomy that tells us how they lived and how they died and about their story?
Well, that's actually a huge question. So as a forensic anthropologist, that's my training in terms of human identification. So normally I would look at skeletal remains, and they can tell a whole story. Bones really do talk. So they can not only tell you somebody's biological sex, they can tell you how tall they were, their racial ancestry, to a sort of biogeographic ancestry, as we now refer to it. And they can also tell you about how that person lived, any injuries, any diseases they may have had that actually show up on the skeleton. And I did a series for the BBC in the UK years ago now called History Cold Case. And what we did in that series is take archaeological remains that were unknown to us. We didn't know anything about them. And we just took them as far as we could in terms of what can we learn about this person? And we applied all the forensic techniques. And this was really an education. That's why we got involved with it. I was working at a forensic centre at the University of Dundee at the time. And it was amazing how much we could learn, because if the Brits do anything well, it's keep records. So historical records were part of that. We could learn about their diet. We could learn about routine activities. Are they using one side of their body more than others. So, did this person wield a sword? Did they ride a horse? And all of that can show up in your skeleton.
Because I suppose activities you undertake routinely, there's an imprint left on how you grow and develop and then potentially sort of decay and die as well.
Exactly. So if you use say you're a swordsman and you use you're right-handed, you will have increased development in the muscles in the right arm and maybe down your back, and I imagine across your torso. You would be smaller on the left, but equally, if you have an injury, you may have, that those muscles may be smaller, and they may actually reflect the fact that you couldn't use that limb as readily. And we see degeneration, so you can see if people have, had a very hard life, a very physical life, physically, doing a very hard job, you'll see earlier degeneration of the skeletal element, so they'll begin to break down.
And I suppose you can learn a lot from people's teeth, can't you? You can learn a lot. That's an area of your expertise. People's heads, their faces, their teeth. We can learn so much from people's teeth. Can you talk to that a little bit?
You can certainly learn a lot about somebody's health from their teeth. You can learn a lot about the kind of culture that they maybe lived in, what access they had to healthcare. But the other thing that you can do with bones, teeth, bones, teeth, hair, any of the hard tissues, you can look at what we call stable isotopes. So you can see what someone's diet was. So you can tell if somebody ate more fish or if their diet was grain-based. You can also look at where in the world they were when they were eating those items, because you get a geographic imprint on those tissues. And different tissues tell you different things. So if you think about your bones, they're not dead hard tissues, they remodel. So you get a turnover in that tissue. So there's an uptake of what you eat into the bones, and that's reflected. Also happens with the nails and it happens with the hair, but much more quickly because they're growing and the turnover rate of tissue is much quicker. So you can get a different pattern of where somebody was geographically and what they were ingesting across a lifespan by looking at the teeth, the bones, the hair, and the nails.
Amazing, fascinating. And bones last a long time, don't they? I think that people think that when you die and you're buried that you decay relatively rapidly, and that can be the case, but some bones can last they can end up as fossils, can't they? But there's bones that last hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And
in a lot of those specimens, we can still get viable DNA. So you can still learn a lot about that person's ancestral origin from their bones. As you say, it could be hundreds of years old. And in the series I mentioned, History Cold Case, they were hundreds of years old, and we still got viable DNA samples. It really all depends on the burial environment. DNA can be what I would call denatured if the environment doesn't actually maintain that. So it can be damaged beyond repair, but a lot of the time it is actually preserved. Other situations, you can have bones that are very fresh, very recent, but because of that environment, they can get broken down very quickly. And there was a case I looked at in Scotland where some human remains were found on a beach, and they'd been out in the sun. Now, I know that Scotland is not known for its sun. This is on the East Coast, and you actually, believe it or not, do get quite a lot of sun there. And the bones looked...
For 3 days a year.
I know, but pretty intense sun for those 3 days, right? But the bones looked really old. And that was because they'd been in the sun, they'd been bleached, and it had literally dried out all of the organic elements. So it made the bones look archaeological, looked old, but they weren't. They were actually much fresher. But the environment had literally, sitting in the sand, had sucked out all of the organic element and actually made you think that they were older than they in fact were.
Amazing. So you developed this fascination for investigation, for inquiring into how people live, how people die from their remains, and you take it from archaeology to forensic anthropology. So this is what you're talking about. How does that move into forensics and criminology? Why did you then start looking at more recent examples rather than, relatively ancient cases? Why that move? Because it's a much darker area. Is it because you were always fascinated by how people died as well as how they lived?
I think it's because my skills in terms of looking at how people lived and died was really, when you look at archaeological remains, it's interesting, but it doesn't have impact today. And the cutoff between archaeological and forensic, for listeners who aren't sure, is Some people would say it's around 50 years post-mortem, post-death, if you're looking at skeletal remains. Some people would say 70 years. But in essence, it means that even if that person, even if the offender, if it's a murder, for example, they're going to be dead after 50 or 70 years. So there's nobody to bring to justice, and there's nobody left alive that the victim would have known. So if you think about that 70-year cutoff, if somebody committed murder, it's unlikely 70 years later. It can be hard to make that call. Obviously, they don't put dates on bodies when, people are murdered, but it's all about the context of the environment. So when I started my career, I wanted to do something that had genuine impact for people today. I wanted to be able to give victims answers or their families answers as to what happened or why that happened.
Potentially bring people to justice.
Yeah, and although obviously I don't work in law enforcement, and that was a consideration. I did think about joining the police years ago now. I didn't go down that path. I went down the path of research and academia instead. And in some ways, it's given me a lot more freedom to do things a different way. If you work in policing or in formal investigation, necessarily they have very structured ways of doing things. And so the investigators may not have the flexibility to do things as they would wish to. They have to follow a procedure and protocol, and they can't criticize their employers. So I found, as a forensic scientist and now criminologist, so I moved into that behavioral world when I moved to Australia in 2012, I can question things and I can challenge things. And if I think that something needs to be done differently, or there's a problem with the case, and many people come to me and say, would you look at my case? I think there's been a problem with the investigation. I can do that. My hands aren't tied in a way that they would have been if I was formerly part of the policing service.
That's fascinating. So you've got that freedom to research, to develop in this. What is a relatively new field, forensics? Because I remember being really fascinated and just drawn into Sherlock Holmes. I read the Sherlock Holmes.
I've read them loads of times.
Oh, and you're trying to guess what's going.
Doyle.
Arthur Conan Doyle. Read all of the Sherlock Holmes books, and you're trying to guess what's happened, why, and then that deductive reasoning that Holmes used so well. But forensics it was sort of hinted at, I suppose, in those early days, but it's a relatively new area. When did it really come to the fore in policing, and how has it changed over the decades?
Well, in policing, it's been around for quite a long time. If you talk about the very early techniques, so the fingerprinting techniques, that was recognised very early on. We're going back to like the late 1800s, that it was identified that fingerprints, I'm not going to say they're unique, because unless we tested everybody in the world, we cannot say that no two people share fingerprints, but we believe that people can be individuated reliably with fingerprints. See, I'm the scientist. I'm going to be very careful what you can and cannot say. You can't say
very
they're
bad
unique,
luck
though.
if you've got the same fingerprints as the murderer.
Yeah, for sure. But we cannot say categorically that that's impossible because we haven't checked everybody. But it began to be recognised by scientists earlier on, especially in France, that you could individuate people by facial features, by fingerprints particularly. And as we've moved forward, obviously then DNA in the like 1980s, that was kind of, we understood some of the powers of DNA, but that's not static either. That's changing all the time. What we can do with DNA is still so rich, and you may be aware of some of the forensic investigative genetic genealogy that's really coming to the fore now, where you can put a sample into Ancestry.com or GEDmatch, Family Tree, and you can learn about your ancestral origins. We can also do that with unknown samples from crime scenes and help determine offenders or at least persons of interest. So just because DNA has been around now since the 1980s, 1990s, we began to use it routinely in Australia, still advances are being made. So some parts of forensics are old and, new techniques, but, very established. And some of the new stuff is really exciting.
Have you ever been to a body farm? Because I saw a doc.
I've been to many body farms.
Have you really?
Yeah.
Oh, my God. Tell me about body farms, because I saw forensic entomology.
Yeah, bugs.
Bugs. Oh, my God.
Bugs are fascinating.
Tell me about...
Entomologists are breed unto their own as well.
Tell me about, in gruesome detail, body farms.
So colloquially, a body farm is exactly as it sounds. It's where people have bequeathed their remains to science, normally through medical programs. So the same way that you would donate your body to science if you wanted medics, dentists, etc., to learn from you. You can do the same, and you can tick a box and say, I'm happy for my remains. But we don't call them body farms. We call them forensic taphonomy facilities. And taphonomy is the science of what happens after death. So all of the breakdowns of the tissues. So there is a body farm for to keep it easy down outside of Sydney. I do research there. I've had some really great projects running there with colleagues looking at post-mortem interval, which is one of the key things police need to know, i.e. a body's been found, how long have they been dead? So we're still learning very much about decomposition in an Australian environment. Most of the data we have comes out of the US. I've now lost count how many body farms there are in the US. There's at least 8, and maybe 10 by now. I've been to a few of those. There's one in Canada. So the woman, Professor Shari Forbes, set up the UTS one. She then went to Canada to set up their first one. We're going to have a second one in Australia shortly. So that's exciting. Totally different environment. We'll get totally different results. So yeah, I've done quite a lot of work at those facilities. And it is fascinating watching that decompositional process. And I've actually done a study where we did the whole thing in time lapse from very freshly deceased right the way through to skeletonized, and watched the body moves more than you would think after death too, as the tissues dry out. And so we actually saw that movement. It's the first time anyone's ever captured that. You would think that somebody had moved that body, moved the arms, but no, it was all part of the natural process. And we captured that in real time, in time-lapse imagery.
I remember seeing a video. I was just like very young, and I think I was going to see Clash of the Titans, and they would have shorts before, and there was this strange BBC like short. It was like,
Was it a rabbit?
It was a rabbit.
No, I've seen a rabbit.
And this
too.
rabbit goes ding 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 into the frame, and then croaks, dies, and then nature takes hold, and it's just the insects, the maggots are feasting on it, and it looks alive, and the fur's moving around, and the bones are here and there, and it is really incredible. Do on those body farms, or what did you call them?
Taphonomy.
Taphonomy.
Yeah.
Taphonomy.
Taphonomy.
Taphonomy. Do you have to have like bodies in cars, bodies in barrels, bodies like in caravans, in different settings?
Yeah, because the different activity levels of the insects will greatly affect the decomposition. So imagine somebody dies in a house, all the windows are closed, it's winter, they're dressed in lots of layers, but it's a very cool environment and there's not much entomological bug activity. There aren't many flies, in essence, getting in. So that person is going to decompose at a very different rate to somebody who is in a well-aired room in the middle of summer where there's a lot of fly activity. And so you'll get flies coming to remains very quickly, and they will then lay larvae on the air, and you'll get all of that activity will begin very quickly. And the flies will be attracted to different parts of the body, and then you'll get increased activity in those spaces. I'm trying to be delicate.
Oh my God, we're in the weeds here. So
well, I know we're in the weeds. I know.
I know.
And a body will be decomposed differently outside. Humidity will make a difference. Elevation will make a difference. All sorts of things can impact that time since death. And because Australia is a very different environment to obviously America, and we have multiple environments in Australia, we really need facilities in all these places because we're making pretty poor predictions at the moment because we just don't have that information.
I did work in the funeral trade, and I was around quite a few dead bodies, and I've seen bodies in rigor mortis, and sort of move around like an arm come up and all the rest, and that's pretty disturbing when someone who's very dead sort of just goes up a little bit. What about bodies in water?
So that's a different again.
That would be there'd have to be like salt water, fresh water. If you're in mud, all the rest. You must have an incredibly strong stomach because like
strong stomach, poor sense of smell. That always served me pretty well.
Really poor sense of smell.
Yeah.
Oh my God. So you're working in forensics. What other areas are you working in? Like your speciality was the face and
Yep.
the head. Tell us about that.
So I was very lucky to get offered a PhD scholarship that was part funded by my University of Sheffield in the UK and part funded by the FBI. My project was part of a much larger project that the FBI was running that had several researchers working across it. And part of my job was to help determine if by measuring certain features of the face, so the corners of the eyes, tip of the nose, the ears, etc., you could actually determine what was an average face in the population and also improve our methods of capturing realistic images and identifying people in crowd scenes. So looking for terrorists, etc., or known offenders, at football matches or wherever, and doing it quickly. We've come a long way since then. I did my PhD a long time ago now. So that was my area of expertise for my PhD. And then in 2012, I carried on working in forensics. But when I moved to Australia, I definitely moved more into the behavioural side of things. And people often think that's a bit of a crossover. You either tend to do forensics or you do behavioural. You don't tend to do both. But I think adding together the forensic science, which is I'd class it as a hard science. So it's based in biology, chemistry, there's a lot of maths involved. So it's very hard science, lab-based. And mixing that with the behavioural, which is classed as a soft science, to me makes sense because if somebody came in and committed a crime in here now, right, they come in and they murder us, right? If you came in to assess this scene, you would need to understand with how that offender came in, how they interacted with us, how that scene ended up presenting in the way it was, right? You need that behavioural element to understand the forensic evidence that is present. So to me, the behavioural side and the forensics are two halves of the same thing. And I've got a number of students now who are forensic scientists, but are also trained in criminology. So hopefully that's my legacy. The next generation will have that dual knowledge.
And are you looking at are you talking about how criminals behave or victims behave or both?
Both.
But there's a crime scene. Someone has wounds on their arms or not.
Yep.
Might indicate that person wasn't expecting to be hit, and therefore might have been known, like the perpetrator or the person attacking them was known to them, or it was a surprise. There's a lot you can draw from the behaviours of those people.
Yeah, and you need to definitely look at the victims too. So if somebody did come in here, there's 3 people in this room, who did they attack first? What was the response of the other people? Did they get involved? What are our locations? What's our blood loss? What are our injury patterns? How did that offender or offenders interact with each of us to leave the scene as it is? So you can't ignore the victim. They're the other half of the story.
And so much has been learnt since the sort of 60s and 70s, hasn't it, in terms of profiling. So we now know so much more when it comes to especially people who are committing, a series of murders. We know so much more about the types of people that they are. Talk us through a little bit of that, how that has developed to that sort of psychological assessment and of perpetrators and what we know about their behaviours.
Yeah, this really began with the FBI and their behavioural analyst unit over there. So they began to look at repeat offenders to determine if they could learn factors about them that would help catch them. So that was really where that work began back in the 80s. But you're right, we've come so far since then. So we know much more about different types of serial predators, who their victims may be, what the patterns of behaviour are, what their comfort zones are, by which I mean where are they literally comfortable committing their crimes. And that can vary very much depending on the offender. They could have a really discreet comfort zone or they can have a massive one depending.
It could be like their basement or it
Yep.
could be...
Well, it's generally not going to be likely not to be their basement. I'm not ruling it out. Obviously, we have seen that happen. But generally, a comfort zone for a predator will be somewhere slightly outside of where they live, but it will be close enough that they know the area. They know where, if they're going to commit a murder, where they'll dispose of remains. They know where they're likely to have access and egress routes where they're not going to get caught. So they tend not to do it right on their doorstep, although we have some very infamous examples of literally on the doorstep or in the basement. But your comfort zone can be broader. So if you have a serial predator, and I'm thinking of the Mr. Cruel case down in Melbourne a number of years ago, what we could see in that situation when 3 schoolgirls were offended against, in their own homes and they were abducted and the parents were there. It was a really scary time for Melbourne. But there's a distinct geographical pattern to where that happened. So that offender lived or worked in that area. They clearly knew that area and they were probably familiar with those children, even if it was only by sight.
So probably because of that geographic area, that's someone who felt comfortable in the area. It was less likely that they were just randomly
Yep.
picked that area and just caught the bus in and committed those offences.
Absolutely. They would have known that area. They knew how to get around it. And there was a fourth child who was abducted and we believe may have been part of the sequence. She was unfortunately killed. She was found a year later. So I believe she's probably part of that sequence. And so whoever it was knew that area really well. A couple of girls went to the same school. So I think they either knew the children or had stalked the children or certainly were aware of them and they were targeted, even if they were stranger attacks in terms of the children or families didn't know the offender.
And you use the term predator, which is a very strong term. When I think of predator, I think of a gigantic alien with a big face that opens up that comes here from the other side of the galaxy to hunt us. Is that what these serial offenders, these serial killers are doing? Are they really a predator? Do they feel like they're out there hunting people?
Yes. If you think of the Ivan Milats of the world, Ivan Milat literally went hunting. He picked off prey that he knew he could control. He got better at it. His methods changed over time. He progressed from a knife to a gun. So to control multiple victims, we had, couples being abducted in that case, sometimes males, and we're talking young, healthy, fit people. He had to have a way of controlling them. Literally, someone like Milat, who is a serial, sadistic, predatory individual, will literally go hunting. Yes.
So you raise Ivan Milat, and you have done a number of books on miscarriages of justice, on women who have been murderers, but you've also done a remarkable book on cold cases. And one of the cases you look at is Ivan Milat. So you think that Ivan Milat developed as a killer that changed their techniques, changed their behaviours, became more confident. And I think in your book you do describe his area of operation where he became more comfortable. Tell us a little bit about how you think Ivan Milat changed and became more comfortable.
Oh, I know that he changed. I know that he became more skillful, more successful, but we see that with serial predators. It's like anything. If you love golf and you practice, you get better, right? So these individuals learn how to do things better. They reduce their chances of getting caught. They can recognize who are suitable targets very easily, and they improve their skills over time. Yes. So, somebody who may start with stalking, for example, can escalate to sex crimes, and that can escalate to murder in the worst cases when they're no longer getting the same thrill. So something that may seem like a low-level crime, like, peeping Toms, actually that can be an escalation. That can be a gateway crime. Somebody flashing, for example, people tend to think of that as grubby but harmless. It's not harmless. That person could well be dangerous. They're already engaging people in unwanted sexual activity. That's in essence why people flash at you. They want you to be part of their fantasy, right? That's why these men do this. It's not that huge a step to then start sexually assaulting people because, they want that high. But absolutely people learn. They have areas in which they feel comfortable acting, where they feel confident, and they'll often push the boundaries more and more as they build in their confidence.
One of the areas that's a real indicator for serial killers and their predisposition to violence and to hurt humans is when they start, if they've got a history of hurting animals. That's a key part of a profile, isn't it?
It is, but not, and we're talking really, if we're talking serial killers, we're generally talking about psychopaths. And although psychologists don't differentiate between a psychopath and a sociopath anymore, I do think there are differences and it is still helpful. But in essence, a psychopath is somebody who doesn't feel genuine emotions for other people in the same way that you or I would. They don't feel sympathy, they don't feel love, they don't feel remorse. I believe they do feel anger and frustration and some of those other emotions, but they don't connect with people in the same way that other people do. they're also, if they're successful at it, very good at mimicking emotion. So if somebody, if one of their parents dies, they may be able to mimic how they think they should be reacting, but they're not genuinely feeling it. And if you know the signs, you can sometimes pick those up.
I work in politics.
Academia, politics, policing, a number of pilots, surgeons, people. Psychopaths are drawn to roles where they have a lot of power because they love power and they love controlling other people. So all of those areas where it's very hierarchical and there's a lot of power, you'll get a higher percentage of psychopaths drawn to them.
One of the things that you write about in your book in terms of cold cases, and we'll get to some of those cold cases and what Ivan Milat may have been also responsible for, is the area that he operated in. Because when people think about Belangolo, they think it's a very remote area, but yet Milat seems, by the end, to have been almost blasé. He didn't go to a massive trouble to hide bodies, and he was going to the same area, an area he felt comfortable in. Why was he doing that?
I believe he knew about Belangolo State Forest, and this was what he felt to be a suitable deposition site. Now, you're right, he didn't go to any effort to bury the victims, the 7 Belangolo victims that we know are Ivan Milat victims. And that was very purposeful because we also know that he went back to those scenes. He wanted to go back and spend time with his victims. And that's not unusual because every time he goes back, he's reliving that crime. So he didn't want to bury them. He wanted them to be in places where he could find them. He still has control over them. But you're right, he was using that whole highway up and down that kind of east coast. We know that he was up as far as Newcastle. There's another victim who I believe is his 8th victim, Peter Lecher, who was found in Jenolan Caves in a very similar scenario. He's never formally been listed as a Milat victim, but I do genuinely believe he is. And
Clive Small thought he was, didn't he?
Yeah, he did. And I think there was just lack of political and policing will to prosecute Milat for Peter Lecher. And at the time, I think it was felt in terms of the prosecution that because he was in a different location, had he been included with the other 7, that it may have muddied the water and the jury may have had more doubts about the original 7 if he was added. So I think a strategic decision was made not to include him. But the impact that had, I got to know Peter's father quite well. And so Peter had been kind of going off the rails. He'd been hanging out with the wrong crowd. And Peter's dad has always believed that if he'd offered his son more assistance, he wouldn't have been murdered. That he was, because there were all these rumors around that it was like over a drug debt or something had gone wrong. And in some way, it was Peter's fault. So a lot of people in the community had blamed Peter. Nobody deserves to be stabbed and shot and tied up. And so as I got to know his father, after we did a documentary, after the documentary finished, I went back to see his dad and said, I genuinely believe he's a Milat victim. And even if he's not, no matter who is responsible, Peter wasn't, and you're certainly not. The only person who's responsible for Peter's death is the person who killed him. And I hope that I could give him even the most modicum of comfort, because that man is broken by the fact that he feels responsible for Peter's death. And I think whoever made the decision to not include him didn't realise the lifelong impact it would have on Peter's dad, who to this day feels responsible for his son's murder.
A truly tragic story. I was really moved by the fact he had like $4.40 in his bank account and he'd borrowed $30. And I was a similar age. Like I was his age at that time. And so I felt a lot of empathy, and I'd hitchhiked, and I at times I'd had $4.40 in my bank account as well. And so I think it is an interesting part of the Milat story that there was an effort to catch Milat, which meant that they really had to narrow down their scope of inquiry and their sort of case theory. That is, they didn't really go after the theory that Milat had operated with other people, even though there was a strong suggestion he had, and that he hadn't, as you've just alluded to, hadn't been responsible for other crimes, although they didn't focus on that. In terms of the evidence, the forensic evidence that we have from Belangolo, what suggests that there were more than 2 people involved in those crimes?
Well, this is the age-old question, isn't it? And people argue about, did Milat, act alone, or did he act with somebody else? My sense is he acted alone, and the reason I think that is because a number of people have survived Milat and they've told their stories. Nobody was ever abducted with another person in the car, but then perhaps the people, if he did act in concert with somebody else, then they're less likely to survive if it's 2 against 1 or 2 against 2. So that is possibly explainable. But also, if you look at Milat as an individual, he is so controlling. I just can't see him sharing that.
Trusting someone.
But that doesn't mean he didn't share fantasies with someone. But my sense was, if he did, it would have potentially been with a woman, and the woman would have been more of a voyeur, a passenger in that scenario. But then some information has come out more recently which may suggest that he did. So it's very difficult to say. The scene, I mean, certainly there were a number of weapons used, knives, guns. There were cigarettes at the scene. He didn't smoke. But, whether that was kind of his alter ego that came out when he was in that murderous state, I can't say. I would love to have asked him, not that he would have told me, but, there's always the option that he did have a co-conspirator.
One of the things, because I've been, looking at it, and I'll come to how we came to be working together, and one of the things that I picked up more recently was I think all of the backpackers bar one disappeared on or around his birthday. His birthday was the 27th of December. I think almost all of them disappeared in the last week of the year. So I thought that was just a strange anecdote, something where he feels entitled, empowered to go out hunting and the like. And, this is his sick reward.
There's normally a trigger for these events. And the other thing with Milat is usually there was also something going on in his private life at the time. So maybe, you have a relationship breakdown. And I think when these serial predators lose control over one aspect of their life, they feel the need to go out and commit these crimes to gain control in another area. So some sort of trigger, and there's normally something behind it that forces these people to act at that particular time.
And you've had a look at it, because Task Force Air, that Clive Small headed up and then moved on from, but that you've looked at Peter Letcher, but you believe, if I'm not mistaken, that Milat may have been responsible for other murders 20 years prior.
Exactly.
Can you talk to that?
Yeah, I mean, what is the likelihood that a predator like Milat only, and I don't mean to dismiss the 7 victims, but the victims that we know for sure are Milat victims, what is the likelihood that they're all of them, that we found them all? I just don't believe that makes sense in terms of his criminal trajectory. I think he started a lot earlier. There's a woman that was murdered in the ACT in 1971 called Karen Rowland. Now, she was picked up, we believe her car broke down and she was picked up. Her body was found in a pine forest, similar MO. I genuinely believe she could have been the first Milat victim. So he could have been present and acting along that area from the ACT all the way up to Newcastle over a much longer period than we originally thought.
Because he was charged, I think, in 71 also for the abduction and rape at knife point of 2 young women in the Belangolo area, but he was not convicted. He beat that rap.
That was all a bit of a mess, that one. So, yeah, there were 2 young women. He was charged with raping abduction of both and raping one of them. But in court, basically, this was a different time, thank God. This is back in the 70s. It was basically made out like these women were complicit in this, and they had a really hard time in court, the witnesses. And as you say, he was found not guilty. He admitted having sex with one of the women, but he said it was consensual. And he said that they were lesbians and he was trying to turn them. I know it was, and that at the time was believed, but thank God we live in different times now.
And that brings us to, in a roundabout way, to how we began working together, because I became aware of a unsolved disappearance in my local community, and then a number of unsolved disappearances across the region, including some unsolved homicides of young women on the North Coast. And started asking questions in Parliament that led to revelations that there were scores of unsolved disappearances where there was a high likelihood of foul play and murder, and also unsolved murders in the area of sort of the Central Coast to the Queensland border. And, my lay analysis was that it looked like an anomaly. It looked like a large number for similar demographic, geographic areas. But 3 of those, you believe, may well have been Milat. That's Leanne Goodall, Amanda Robinson and Robin Hickey, who all disappeared in about a year or so from that Newcastle area. So talk to us a little bit about that, why you think they may have been connected to Milat.
Yeah, so when that all happened, it came out, and I remember you made a statement in Parliament, didn't you? And I actually did an interview, and I said I'd be very happy to work for New South Wales Police. We've already begun at the University of Newcastle. I used to be the director of the clinic there, the Justice Clinic, and we'd already started work looking at patterns of missing and murdered. So we had a bit of a database that we'd started, and I said in the interview that if New South Wales Police wanted assistance with that, I'd be very happy to help them. Now, New South Wales didn't reach out to me, but you did. And so what I've done in the interim since all of that happened, we looked at women only. We restricted to biological, women only. We looked at 1977, but we brought it all the way up to 2024 because we didn't see the point of stopping at 2022. And we found 72 cases. We then broke it down, and these are some fantastic work done by students at the university and one of my colleagues, broke it down to some geographic areas. Now, the area you're particularly talking about is Newcastle, and I'm very familiar with these cases, having been at the University of Newcastle for 7 years. So between 1978 and 1980, there are 6 cases that really need to be looked at. And as you say, Leanne Goodall, Amanda Robinson and Robin Hickey, all when Tim Watson Monroe and I looked at this a few years ago.
So who's Tim Watson Monroe?
Watson Monroe is, I do a podcast with Tim and we do Motive and Method, and he's a criminal psychologist.
Check it out.
Yeah, it's awesome if you're interested in true crime. We do lots of why do people do the worst things that they do? And so Tim and I worked together on a documentary about Milat, which is how I have some of this knowledge of his activities. And we found that those 3 young women and girls were particularly susceptible. They were at bus stops. They, were at hotels that Milat is known to have frequented, and they were certainly with his victim type. So, yeah, there are a number of clusters that we've identified. I'm going to share the information that we have with you. I think there are 4 clusters, around that space in that across that time span that really deserve some further analysis.
And so you believe that those clusters may be the activities of a number of predators,
Yep.
not one super predator. I think you've described it.
Yep.
As terrible as that sounds.
Yeah, we're not heroising them. We're not saying they're awesome, but in terms of their sheer scale of offending, yes, are they extremely active? Is what we mean by that. Now, there's no evidence of that. Even across that entire 77 to 2024, I do believe there are a number of serial predators, but they may be responsible for 3, 4, 5 incidents. What they're not is we're not looking at 50 or 60. Now that's I would say that the data analysis we've done at the moment is quite superficial. We need to do a lot more deep dive into that, and there's a lot more that can be done looking for those patterns. And I know that we're going to talk about how that might happen. There may be other predators hiding in there that are disguising their patterns or moving more broadly or have a broader victim type. So I've grouped them largely by obviously sex, biological sex, age, location. Those are my key factors we've looked at so far, but there may be other patterns in there that I've not seen yet. And I want to do a much deeper dive in there to see. And also we need to include males, because we've excluded males at the moment from
And we only went from 1977.
Yeah, we did. And so if we exclude males, I think we may actually be losing some of the predatory patterns too. If you look at Ivan Milat, he didn't only take females, he took females and couples, males and females, if Peter is one of his victims, single males. So we may be losing a lot of the texture and deep information if we don't include the males in that. So going forward, I am going to include the males and make sure that we're seeing a broader scope of what that data is telling us.
Which is truly remarkable and terrible at the same time that our society had predators operating, that young women disappeared quite literally from out the front of their
Never
homes,
seen again.
from the bus stop, walking home from the pub, and very little was done about it at the time. Why was and could you just talk to why this was a sort of unique time? Why in the 70s and 80s and into the 90s did this occur, and why does it appear to have sort of diminished out of our society? Or why don't we see it as much as we may have been seeing it in that time? What behaviourally has changed?
There are a number of cultural and investigative factors at work here. So I think if we go back to the 60s, 70s, 80s, young people, especially young women, were a lot more autonomous. They were going out more. They were doing a lot more on their own. Previous to that, they wouldn't have been out as young people at bus stops, going to clubs. So that was a cultural, social change, which, and I'm not victim blaming, but what that did is put them in more vulnerable situations than previously they would have been in. They were at those pubs and clubs, and there's obviously nothing wrong with that. That made predators, they made them more easily accessible to predators. So we saw that change. Also, there wasn't the fear factor. We didn't expect these predatory individuals. So there wasn't the caution that we have today. People don't hitchhike today. By and large, they don't. It's too dangerous. Not only for the person hitchhiking, but for the person who, I don't want a hitchhiker getting in my car. I don't know who they are. So we know these things now that they didn't have that knowledge at the time. So I think that's changed.
Because up until the sort of 80s, we didn't really, police and law enforcement hadn't really put two and two together, that they had people out there who were killing for the thrill, for to satisfy some sick need. They hadn't really put that together, had they?
No, and if you look,
so they weren't warning the community, and that it wasn't something that they.
It wasn't a recognised danger. So if you think about the Beaumont siblings who disappeared on Australia Day, 1966, those three kids, Jane, Anna, Grant. Jane was 9, Anna was 7, Grant was 4. They went off to the beach at Glenelg, in South Australia for the day. That wouldn't happen today because we know too much about the children and risks. Those risks we didn't think they existed at the time. That fundamentally changed Australian culture. And then obviously we had the 2 children disappeared from Adelaide Oval. That was a different time. 60s, 70s, 80s, different time. We have much more knowledge now. So I don't think people are maybe behaving in the same ways. They're much more risk adverse. Most people, they take more cautions. And you also have the technological advances. So I'm wearing a smartwatch. It's got GPS in it. So it's got a heart rate monitor. If I were to die, my watch knows exactly when my heart stopped and it knows exactly where I was. I carry a mobile phone with GPS tracking in it. If somebody is abducted, if somebody was abducted off the street outside, there's going to be endless car footage, security camera footage, all that kind of stuff. This didn't exist then. So investigatively, things have changed. Investigative knowledge has changed. And so I think with the behavior patterns of societal change, generally speaking, people are less vulnerable to serial predators, but also police are much better at catching them.
And do you think that people are better at intervening and identifying people early on who are potentially a risk to themselves and society? We now understand more about the events, the predisposition people have to have had to become these, because serial killers aren't born. In a way, they're created, aren't they?
Oh, that's the debate. I think some serial killers are in fact born. I think the
Really?
Ivan Milats of the world, yeah. I think it's rare, but I think somebody like Ivan Milat, no matter his environment, because I believe he was a true psychopath, would always have gone on to become a very violent, dangerous individual. And I guess that's the crux between the difference between a psychopath and a sociopath. So in layman terms, I would say a psychopath is born and a sociopath is made. Now, they may have the same attributes. They may lack empathy because that's the same between the two groups. sympathy, remorse, etc. But a psychopath is always going to be the same regardless of their environment. They can have the most stable, loving upbringing. They're always going to be a violent, predatory individual. A sociopath can be born with those tendencies, but if they have a nice, stable upbringing, they can diminish those behaviors. If they have a poor upbringing, it can exacerbate them. And the difference is psychopaths are generally, they plan better, they generally have a higher IQ, they're harder to catch because they make more forensic countermeasures, so they're more risk adverse. A sociopath is much more reactive, emotionally reactive. They're more likely to explode of a moment, and they're more likely to leave evidence behind as a result.
That's fascinating, because when you think about Ivan Milat, and you've made that case that he was a psychopath, when people talked about him, they said he was like a cold, calculating person. And some people were sort of surprised that he had this explosive, violent anger in it. They were like, oh, I remember reading about his neighbour saying, oh, the fellow,
It's always the middle-aged white guy living in the suburbs.
Yeah.
Always. It's always the one you don't expect.
Yes, perfectly kept car, taking mum to the cemetery, and on his birthday going and savagely murdering strangers in a forest. A terrible.
And taking mementos from his female victims, giving his girlfriend a T-shirt of one of the victims, so that every time she wears it, she's wearing one of the T-shirts of his murder victims.
And a real contempt and arrogance, and like a sense of being untouchable, like to keep the murder weapons, to keep the mementos, to give them to friends. It's sort of not only an indifference to like human life and suffering, but an indifference to sort of the law, like as if I'm smarter than everyone, I'm above everyone.
Well, that's often psychopathy is mixed with narcissism. So these are both dark traits, dark personality traits, and they're often what we call comorbid. So if somebody has true psychopathic, and there's a whole continuum of those, they are quite often a narcissist or a sadist perhaps, so they may enjoy watching harm be caused to other people. So often these behaviors are actually intertwined in one individual. And when you get that, and when they have a violent nature as well, this is when you get these really dangerous people. But fortunately, those people are few and far between. There'll be lots of psychopaths in all those different jobs we mentioned, but they don't have violent tendencies. They're not sadistic. They may well be narcissists, but they're not causing physical harm. Now, that doesn't mean they're not harmful, because they can cause really serious distress to the people around them, the people they work with, but they're not physically harming people.
Fascinating. Now, where we're up to is we have done some preliminary. You have done.
The Royal We has done.
The Royal We has done this preliminary research into the murdered and missing on the North Coast. What needs to happen now for us to really drill down into what happened and potentially discovering how it happened?
Well, I would still be very keen to work with New South Wales Police. Now, police are always reluctant to have outsiders come in, but I do think it can be helpful when there's an outsider that can come in, a new pair of eyes, think about things in a different way. So having looked at the data, the report I'm going to give you, to me it feels really superficial, because I just think there's so much more nuance we can do. And actually, I'm going to look at the possibility of actually using AI. If we could train a model to actually do data mining to collect some of this information and actually start to pull out the patterns for us, I think that is the way forward. So that's my game plan here, and it may take some money to do that. So yes, that's my next idea, is how do we actually get the true patterns in this data? Because if we can figure out what the patterns are, ultimately we can hopefully catch people, that preemptive strike before they go on to harm more people.
Isn't it Minority Report? Where the AI has done a profile and you're convicted of multiple murders.
Not before you've even done it. But I think there are so many opportunities if we get better at pattern recognition in these crimes to actually identify somebody who's going to be a serial predator before they become one. Mm-hmm. Now, we have seen that with some people. We know that some really disturbed individuals have been arrested after their first crime, who, Tim and I have discussed this, who genuinely believe would have gone on to be serial killers. So we are much better at it. But especially with these cold cases, I think they can get left behind. But there's patterns in here. I just need to be able to find them.
And because a lot of the records for these crimes and the investigations and the data that was collected, it's on paper, it's in archives, it's analog, and then we've moved to this into the digital age, which has then enabled things like forensics and cross-referencing of huge data sets to occur. But with the advent of AI and much more powerful microprocessing and computing power, we may be able to see things that a human probably couldn't see.
Absolutely, and do it much more quickly.
Yep.
And so that's where I think the future of some elements of policing is that pattern recognition. I'm not trying to take the humans out of this, but I do think there is a lot of opportunity for AI to assist us. And so that is where I think I'd like to go, is to see whether we can really use this new fantastic resource. Obviously, there can be problems with it, but I really think there are opportunities here.
It is a truly fascinating area. I'm committed to continuing to work on this because I just think that as a society we can't forget. We just can't forget when people are murdered. We can't ignore these injustices. We can't say it's all too hard, because we don't know what opportunities are going to come in terms of technology, and by talking about it, there's been some criticism of me and others when you say, well, when you talk about these things, it's difficult and you hurt people, you enliven difficult memories. But overwhelmingly, the families of these victims, they don't want these matters just put in the freezer. They want someone looking at them again and again, don't they?
Well, I'll share a couple of anecdotes with you then. So I get criticism levelled at me in a similar way. So back in 2018, as I mentioned, I was involved with the dig for the Beaumont children down in South Australia at the cast alloy factory. So when that happened, I got a couple of random emails. I always get random emails.
Well, tell us what happened there. Tell us the lead up.
So we had
the Beaumont children disappeared, a notorious case from the beach in South Australia.
Channel 7 did a documentary, and we looked at one specific individual called Harry Phipps and whether he could have been responsible for the disappearance of the Beaumonts. Now, I was asked to look at him from a criminological and forensic perspective, and I expected to think he wasn't a suitable suspect. I always go in with a presumption of innocence in mind. It's my background. It's obviously the forensics that's where you should approach things from. However, the more I looked at him, the more I thought he could be a genuine suspect. He was a very damaged individual. There was evidence that he was a child sex offender against his own son. Hayden gave evidence before he sadly died. And Harry owned this cast alloy factory back when the children disappeared. We had eyewitnesses to say they dug a hole that long weekend of the Australia Day. Harry Phipps was there. So we dug and we found the hole. We didn't find anything in the hole except some rubbish, which I always thought was a bit bizarre. But anyways, there's this whole factory site that really deserved kind of more attention. It's actually going to get that attention. I don't know when this is going to air, but the dig is either going to have happened or, is imminently going to happen. They're going to spend a week looking at that site. So that case, we looked at it in 2018. A couple of random people emailed me, and one of them said, you should stop looking. You're dragging up these memories. Wherever the children are, leave them in peace. Now, I didn't respond, but I did think, wherever those children are, they are not at peace. No. I believe they've been violently murdered, and if they're buried in some hole on a factory site, they deserve to be found, they deserve to get their names given back to them, and they deserve to be returned to their extended family. Sadly, their parents are both deceased, but there are people who care about what happened to those children, and the community of Glenelg and South Australia more broadly, and even Australia, deeply cares about what happened to those 3 children. And the father actually contacted us and thanked us for looking and said it meant a lot to him that people still cared enough to look for his children. And I felt personally like I'd let him down, actually, when he died without us being able to give him those answers, because he waited until he was in his 90s and he never found out what happened to his children.
Yes, well, that's been my experience. That overwhelmingly, in actual fact, I've never had anyone say, look, I don't want to find out what happened to my murder.
Once, and I won't name the case, but one family member I've only heard once say, stop looking, I know they're dead. And that was, I thought that was a bit suspicious, but I spoke to an investigator on that case and he said, no, they're just a really unusual person. Nobody else ever. They want answers.
The only experience I've had is someone has said, "Look, I don't want you to talk about this because I know who did it."
Yeah,
And
that's
they-
also
So they said, "Look, we're certain it was X, and so this is difficult because that they haven't been convicted."
especially if it's somebody in their community or in their family, that can cause problems. Yeah, so that does happen. But then another family, Karen Rowland's family, I've been working with for a number of years now. You know, her parents are deceased, but her siblings are still alive. They still desperately want answers. And we're talking, you know, the 70s. We're talking a long time ago. And it's as alive today for them as the day she vanished.
Well, Xanthé, I'm sure that we'll continue to work. We're going to raise. I'm organising a meeting with the New South Wales Premier, Chris Minns. I've already met with him to foreshadow your work. He said he was looking forward to seeing it. To tell him that we're doing this work. He made a commitment to me to meet with you, to consider this work and to consider funding towards further research. And I'm certainly hopeful that we get that. We get more answers. We may not catch the killers, but at least we let the community know and potential people doing these crimes that we're paying attention and we're doing everything we can to bring past perpetrators to justice and prevent them into the future.
And I think what I'd like to add to that is along the New South Wales northern coast, I don't think there's an active predator now. There's no indication in the data that there is a serial predator active. So I don't want people to be fearful of that. I don't think that's the case. But if you are an offender, I also want you to know that we're getting much better at catching you. So just because you did something 30, 40 years ago, do not sleep well at night because, these techniques are advancing and someone will knock on your door.
And DNA lives forever.
Oh, yeah,
we
love
know it lives
the DNA.
hundreds and hundreds of years. And I've read cases where there was a man who was convicted, and one of the reasons he was convicted in the States was he kept Googling, how long does DNA last?
Dear God, you would not believe
how
the
long does it take
searches
to
on people's computers.
Yeah.
Like, some things you would think would be a joke. They're searching, how do I poison somebody with cyanide? How long does a body take to decompose in acid? Like, unbelievable what people search. Yeah.
How long does it take for a body to decompose in acid?
Oh, it's depending on the acid, the strength of the acid, it can be pretty quick. Yeah. But it would denature the DNA. It would cause a lot of problems for the forensic.
Right.
But there would be a lot of other evidence, you see. So
There'd be the acid. Why were you filling your
why is your
bathtub up
bath full of acid? But what offenders don't, I think what they fail to realise, and especially the ones who think they're super clever. So, yeah, they may think they're cleverer than the police, but we're talking really seasoned investigators who have seen a lot. They know people. They also have at their behest all of these experts, right? So an offender has to not only outthink all of the police, they have to outthink every expert that can be called upon. And so they have to be really, really good to cover all of their tracks. So I think that's why we're seeing less people become serial predators, because we're just getting better at identifying them and catching them.
Well, that is a fantastic note to end on. I really appreciate you coming onto the podcast. I appreciate the work you've done over your career to bring more knowledge into this critical area, to bring potentially people to justice. So thank you very much for the work you've done. Thank you very much for coming on the podcast, and let's hope we get an outcome from the New South Wales Premier.
Well, thank you for the invitation. I've enjoyed it. And I'm going to try and talk you into going to a conference with me in June to look at this policing element with AI. So yes, thank you very much.
Thanks, Xanthé.